Okay, welcome everyone. Nonprofit Association of the Midlands Guidelines and Principles e-learning series. The Guidelines and Principles cover legal compliance and best practices in all areas of nonprofit management and operations. We've built a website called guidelandandprinciples.org where you can find a wiki database with compiled research, background information, and sample documents in each of these areas. On the website, you can take online assessments and immediately receive prioritized action plans based on your responses. There you'll also find recordings to this presentation series with bookmarks, so you can skip around to the sections of the presentation you need to hear right now with a single click. If you've not yet been to guidelandandprinciples.org, we highly encourage you to do so. It's free and open to all nonprofits. My name is Todd, and this month we're exploring strategic alliances with David Thompson. We're going to look at what we mean by strategic alliances and the full range of possibility for nonprofit partnership, and David is going to talk to us about all the considerations an organization should make and some of the legal and procedural aspects to merging two organizations. David has 25 years of experience practicing law, fundraising nonprofit organizations, and working as a teacher, academic administrator, and supervisor of capital projects. He was Associate Dean for Planning and Programs at the University of Chicago. David has served on boards of the National Public Housing Museum, 3 Arts, and the Resource Center. He has also taught and lectured on the arts, environmental sustainability, and other topics. Currently, he serves on the board of Illustration Exchange Omaha, which is the result of a merger of 3 aligned organizations. So now we're in good hands there. Before we dive into the presentation, I want to encourage you to ask questions and request clarifications throughout the presentation through the chat feature on the left side of your screen. Click Show Chat to enable and type your questions in the bottom left part. When David reaches a good stopping point in his presentation, he can address your question. Your identity will remain anonymous, so feel free to pose any question. For the record, we're recording today's presentation and we'll make it available to watch on our website with supplemental materials and further reading on our YouTube channel. Okay, David, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today to shed light on a difficult but essential subject in nonprofit management. Can you tell us why you were compelled to join us and present today?
Well, first of all, Todd, I want to thank you and your colleagues here at the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands. I think this Guidelines and Principles is actually extremely useful, and I'm very pleased to have been invited to participate on the topic of strategic alliances, which is sort of near and dear to my heart for a number of different reasons. I think one of them is the fact that I've come at strategic alliances from a number of different directions, both from the for-profit sector and the non-for-profit sector, and both from a legal standpoint and more of an operational, organizational standpoint. So I feel as if I've gathered, just in my own experiences, certain pieces of information that I would love to, and today intend to pass on to folks whose organizations might be pondering transactions of their own. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of all this, I just did want to say a few things. I mean, if those of you have seen presentations on strategic alliances in the past, they tend to go one of 2 directions. One direction is to introduce the topic of strategic alliances and then spend a lot of time understanding the very specific differences between the different kinds of alliances, whether it's a joint venture or whether it's a parent-subsidiary relationship or whether it's an acquisition. We've decided not to spend a huge amount of time poking through all of those details about the different kinds of alliances. We've tried to adopt a more general perspective. But on the other hand, I would also say that there are plenty of presentations out there which focus almost exclusively on mergers, because a merger of all the different kinds of strategic alliances, mergers are really the ones that require the most attention to detail, the most attention to process, and really just the most work. So what we've tried to do today is sort of strike a middle ground and talk in general terms about strategic alliances, and most of the time, not always, I use the term transaction instead of using the term merger or acquisition or any of those other ones. I try to adopt the most general terminology possible. And one reason for saying that is that, as we go through all of our slides, certain pieces of the process might not be essential to the particular situation that your organization is in, depending on the kind of transaction that you're pondering. I mean, we go into quite a bit of detail here, and it's sort of up to you and your board and various advisors to decide, how many of these pieces fit into your specific situation. So with that, I think I'll move on to the topic of strategic alliances, but first say a little bit about the environment in which these transactions are coming about. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons for strategic alliances, and there's a lot going on in the nonprofit sector right now to make them something worth looking at. I mean, the number one reason for pursuing a strategic alliance is to achieve some kind of efficiency for your organization and the one or two other organizations that are involved. And there's different kinds of efficiencies. We all know what they are when it comes to running nonprofits. Either we can eliminate the duplication of programming or services, which uses resources that could best be put towards something else. A strategic alliance can often be used to extend an organization's service area. If there's a geographic area in which your organization doesn't have a presence, but there is an organization that's similar to yours or doing something similar that does have a presence in that organization, then some kind of strategic alliance between the two can be a great way to enter into a new geographic area. Another reason for pursuing a strategic alliance is to bring new expertise into the organization. Sometimes there are things you recognize it would be great that if your organization could do in order to really fulfill your mission, but you don't have the expense or you don't have the resources or the time to devote to building up the expertise from scratch within your organization. So some kind of strategic alliance with an organization that does have that expertise is often a great way to kind of expand the portfolio of services of your organization. And then last but not least, and this is something that pops up quite a bit, is that strategic alliances often arise from the need to help an organization that's in financial trouble. So organizations that are not doing too well standing on their own often make appropriate candidates for a strategic alliance. And that is usually a case where it would be a merger, because you'd more or less just be kind of purchasing all the assets of the distressed organization. So in addition to these reasons for pursuing strategic alliances, it's important to understand what's going on in the funding environment that's also sort of impelling us in the direction of strategic alliances. One is something that we're all familiar with and that has become even more acute in the last few years, and those are the financial considerations, the budgets at the federal and the state level, and other kinds of cuts that have really been in play ever since we had the financial crisis of 2008, but also various events that have happened since then, like the sequestration of 2013. There are just cuts going on all over the place, and oftentimes I find if you look at a specific organization, there's some very specific funding stream that organization has come to depend on, which has for one reason or another shrunk or sometimes even been eliminated altogether. So this shift in the financial environment, of course, makes things more competitive for nonprofits in terms of seeking grant money and money from individual donors and money from government agencies. There's just more competition all the way around. And in addition to the increased competition, there's also an increased emphasis on accountability and impact. And basically what that means is being able to prove either to your funders or to your board or to various accrediting agencies that you're spending the money well, that you're accomplishing your programmatic goals, that you are having a real impact out there. Organizations, I mean, with money being tight, a foundation is going to be much more likely to want to give its money to an organization that has hard evidence of the benefit of programming rather than an organization that does not. And then there's another issue which I think is sort of maybe a little bit more difficult to spot, although there might be one or two experts on the phone who can enlighten us about this. And this is what I mean by sector-specific shifts in how we approach programming. I think this is particularly evident in the human services area, where there's just all sorts of new methodologies out there that encourage organizations to work together just so that there's a kind of continuum of services when it comes to, whether it's the juvenile justice system or helping people with a history of homelessness or a history of substance abuse. In those kind of areas, it's easy to see how there can be benefits from different organizations that focus in different areas of the life experience of a homeless person or a substance abuser that can be addressed more effectively if the organizations are working together rather than just kind of passing clients from organization to organization. So this shift in the direction of thinking about what you could call wraparound services or continuum-based services, one of the terms under the Affordable Care Act, for instance, is accountable healthcare organizations who are, under statute committed to pursuing this kind of wraparound approach. And then in addition to, these sort of shifts in methodology, there's also just more input and sometimes pressure coming from funders, whether they're government funders or private foundations or individual donors. They themselves oftentimes, as a condition or as just part of the conversation that they have with potential grantees, want to encourage them to seek out collaborations where possible to make the dollars go further. So I think maybe at this point, before we jump into the actual need of the transactions, are there any questions so far about the environment for strategic alliances or anything else we've said so far?
Okay, well maybe we could, we'll take a look at kind of the broad spectrum of strategic alliances. This is a really great graphic that helps us kind of understand the different levels of strategic alliances. And as you can see from left to right, it looks at various levels of autonomy and integration. So on the left side, we have low collaboration, in the middle, sort of a medium level, and full corporate integration on the right. And I'll let David explain a little bit about what he sees on this spectrum.
Well, when you coming at this from a legal perspective, really the main question is always going to be what level of integration is there going to be, and how is that integration going to be articulated? Are the two organizations going to launch a joint program together such that a joint venture agreement can pretty much sum up everything in one document, because the two organizations aren't really undergoing any extreme changes? They're just getting together to work on a particular kind of programming together. And then there are situations such as a joint venture where usually there is a third organization, a brand new organization, the joint venture organization that's formed. So in a case like that, how the two or three organizations that are getting together on the joint venture, how they're going to share the assets of the joint venture, the liabilities of the joint venture, who's going to be responsible for the joint venture achieving its goals. And then in a case like a merger, which is what we'll be talking about later on, is in those cases it's very specific that the organizations participating in the merger usually both cease to exist, and there's a brand new organization that comes into being that essentially assumes all of the liabilities and assets of the preceding organization. So, whether an organization continues to exist after the transaction, whether there's a brand new organization that comes into existence as a part of the transaction, those are all issues that come about depending on what level of integration the parties are seeking.
So, as David said earlier, we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at these individual types of partnerships or mergers or integrations, but we do want to provide a few different examples of things that we've seen that are fairly common, that just look at approaches or the ways in which different organizations might arrive at the question of a strategic alliance. So the first one is something that we see a lot at the Nonprofit Association. We see a lot of people thinking about starting a new nonprofit. So an individual or a group has identified a community need, perhaps in their own neighborhood, and would like to address the issue by becoming a nonprofit. They volunteered with nonprofits in the past, but have little experience in management or governance. Family and friends are serving on the board, and everyone is passionate about the issue but may lack knowledge of broader approaches. And they may have varying levels of support outside of their group. The first thing that we always ask organizations is, or people thinking of starting a nonprofit, is, are you a program or an organization? Are you as passionate about financial management and governance as you are about the issue? And really this boils down to the time, energy, and resources that are required to run an entire organization. It's also about where people actually want to put their energies. So do you want to deliver the program and solve the problem and spend 90% of your time doing that and 10% doing administration? Or would you like to do 50-50 or even 60% administration as you try to keep your legal entity afloat and meet all the requirements of being a 501c3 organization? And then again, usually the answer is, well, I didn't realize how much it was going to take to run an organization, but the problem still exists and we think we have a solution. So the next question we ask is anyone else doing the same thing or something very similar? We encourage people who want to start a nonprofit to do the same types of things that any aspiring entrepreneur would do. Do a market study, do a feasibility study, look around in your environment and see who else is doing similar things and whether the need for your organization is really as great as you think it is, or if it isn't being addressed by someone else that you could potentially partner with. And then also looking at the viability of the organization in terms of getting some kind of sustainable funding and making sure that that level of support is there. So this is the type of situation and question that might lead a concerned citizen to decide not to start a nonprofit, but to maybe take their idea and merge with somebody else. The second type of group is something that we've been seeing a lot more recently. It's the idea of collective impact. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's just another example of the ways in which different organizations come together. And there are 5 conditions for being a collective impact organization, and it means that you have to have a backbone support organization, someone to support and coordinate the efforts of multiple organizations that have all dealing with a similar kind of issue. So they have some mission alignment. As David mentioned earlier, that could be in the realm of homelessness or child welfare, education, and basically taking multiple organizations that are addressing a broader issue and having them work together and share information. One example of that is MATCH here in the metro area, the Metro Area Continuum of Care for the Homeless. This is 45 different organizations in the Omaha metro area that address some part of homelessness, but who are have now decided to share information, conduct regular meetings so that each organization knows what the other is doing. It allows them to go after funding together, both on the federal level and local private foundations. But all of these organizations have also maintained their autonomy. So you might find them somewhere in the middle to the left of that spectrum that we showed earlier. This is an example of the way that MATCH is meeting those 5 conditions of collective impact and trying to collaborate on some level.
Thanks, Todd. I wish I could say I had a colorful graphic as beautiful as yours. But the third example is actually reflective of my own experience since coming back to Omaha. I joined the board of Restoration Exchange, and what I learned through that experience of getting to know the organization is that it was actually the result of a merger of 3 organizations that came about through external motivation, and that's kind of an interesting aspect of the situation in the sense that this organization, Omaha by Design, which is involved in all sorts of different projects related to urban planning and neighborhood revitalization, they took it upon themselves to assess the environment for historic preservation activity in the Omaha Council Bluffs metropolitan area. So they commissioned a study by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which of course has experience dealing with historic preservation efforts all across the country. So back in 2011, a few consultants from the National Trust for Historic Preservation came to town and did a survey, an environmental study. And what they found was not a huge surprise, but it was a little bit depressing, and that is that historic preservation was not a very high priority for the Omaha Council Bluffs metropolitan area, and that the movement for historic preservation lacked vibrancy, and that's partly the result of various experiences that have happened in the past. I won't delve into the history of all the buildings that have been torn down and the effects that it's had on the public, but it has had an effect on efforts to pursue historic preservation ever since then. And then last but not least, the report pointed out policy barriers that were making it harder for property owners to pursue landmark status or neighborhoods to pursue designations that would enable them to preserve their historic landmarks as well. So as a result of this external study, 3 Omaha organizations, one called Landmarks, Inc., one called Omaha Urban Neighborhoods, and one called Restore Omaha, which all had very different kinds of programming, but the programming was all related to the issue of historic preservation. So on the recommendation of this report, they basically came together last year, and we just celebrated our 1-year anniversary as a new or not so new organization.
Congratulations.
Restoration Exchange Omaha. So with those 3 anecdotes to work from, let's dive in. And I guess I'll say as we do dive in that I tend to be very process-oriented. That's not just because of my background as a transactional attorney. It's actually more because of my experience with communications. I think that the more attention you pay to process, and by that I mean, what kinds of conversations need to take place, how many meetings do there need to be, whose input needs to be sought, that the more care you put into thinking through that whole process, the better off you'll be in the end, in terms of having everybody that you need to have on board, whether it's your board members, whether it's your major funders, whether it's the staff of your organization, whether it's the community, what have you. Providing all of those different constituencies with opportunities to have input on the process is really crucial to its success. And I do think it's important to really be careful about understanding what the primary impetus for a transaction is. Is it political? And by that I mean, are there certain pressures in the community to, give resources to one organization as opposed to, another organization? Is there the sense in the community that there are too many organizations? Are people confused? Is the philanthropic community looking for consolidation in order to make their dollars go farther? Or have they conducted their own studies that have identified different kinds of activities that organizations could work on together along the lines of what we've already talked about? Again, we come back to the issue of finances. Is a particular transaction moving forward because one or more organizations is having financial troubles and needs to be helped? Or is it, the financial situation overall, which we also talked about earlier? And then last but not least is reputational considerations. Is there something involved with, trying to extend the brand of an organization? Is it attempting, is it trying to provide opportunities for smaller organizations to sort of hop on board with an organization or a brand that's already well established and benefit from that? So these are just some of the issues that are often driving a transaction, and I think it can be helpful in terms of understanding how you're going to approach the transaction, what kinds of pressures those are. And then again, as we've said, it's really important to identify what the specific benefits of a transaction are going to be. Is it going to be improvement in the quality? Oh, I see a typo there. Apologize for that. Improvement in the quality of existing services that one or more organizations provides, or is it going to be an improvement in efficiency of existing services, basically meaning a lower cost, making dollars go farther? Is the transaction going to result in an improvement in the ability to raise funds? Sometimes, whether it's animal rights, juvenile justice, whatever cause you might have, and sometimes the cause is helped if donors know exactly where to go if they want to express their support. And it's interesting to notice the bewildering array, for instance, of veterans organizations that have popped up over the last few years, and it is really hard to try to figure out which ones are the best ones to bestow your charitable dollars upon. So, and then again, another reason is this ability to add new services to the portfolio of one or more of the organizations. Especially with what we were talking about earlier, there's this idea of one-stop shopping in a way for various constituencies who are served by nonprofits, that it should be easier for them to figure out where they need to go to get the help, and certainly consolidations can help with all of that. And then I haven't mentioned the third bullet point on this page, but it might actually belong at the top, and that is thinking about whether or not the transaction is consistent with the missions of all the organizations involved, particularly as those missions have been articulated in any kind of strategic planning documents or other kind of documents out there that sort of lay out what the plan is for one or more of these organizations. Because it is important that the merger isn't something, or other kind of transaction isn't something that just falls in your lap for one reason, and the organization or organizations goes for it, without really thinking through the question of, well, how does this affect the other plans that we've already made? Does this help us or hurt us when it comes to achieving the goals that we've already laid out for ourselves? So those are all things to think about at the very early stages of the transaction. And those, as I said, those kinds of issues come into play when we're thinking through the process of the transaction as well. So, for instance, this first bullet point asking whether there have been any evaluations or other studies to identify needs that a merger or some other kind of transaction is intended to address. That's just like the situation I described with Restoration Exchange, where the National Trust for Historic Preservation, through external forces entirely, came into the community and did their own assessment. Oftentimes, organizations do their own needs assessment and lay out, 1, 2, or 3 areas in which they want to improve, and strategic goals can certainly be helpful in doing that. So I think, the more likelihood there is some kind of written document separate from the transaction itself that sort of explains what some needs that need to be addressed or some changes that the organization needs to undergo. Those are all extremely helpful in sort of providing the kind of foundation that you want for a transaction as big as a merger. It's also helpful to sort of identify how these partners found each other. Are they peer organizations that have been working together for years? Is one of the organizations involved functioning in a geographic area that the parent organization hasn't really been active in, so maybe they didn't know each other that well? It's interesting when you look at a lot of the scholarship that's out there already on mergers in the nonprofit sector. It seems the case studies often focus on organizations that identify merger partners in a rather almost a for-profit kind of way, doing very careful market research, looking at the numbers, and then often approaching an organization that they had no previous relationship to. I realize that doesn't map onto all the different kinds of strategic alliances that are happening out there, but that's just something that's interesting to notice. And all of this, I think, should be, as soon as possible, be summarized in a letter of intent. And that letter of intent can be something that's negotiated between, the 2 chief executives of the organization. I think it's a good idea for the board, board perhaps to review either a term sheet or a draft of the letter of intent before it's actually signed, of course. It's good to have your counsel, your organization's counsel, help prepare the letter. As a matter of fact, they can probably help be the primary authors if they've been involved in any kind of strategic alliance transactions in the past. And so the letter of intent needs to spell out a few important things related to the transaction to make sure that everybody is literally on the same page. So one of those pieces of information that needs to be included in the letter of intent is some idea about how long the preliminary discussions are going to go on. Is it going to be 3 months? Is it going to be 6 months? That can be important because otherwise conversations about a strategic alliance can often drag on even for a few years. And if you want to be expeditious about it, it's often very helpful to specify a time period by which the board or the officers of organizations have to sign off on the transaction so that it can move forward. Before it moves forward, though, there has to be a period of due diligence, and it's very important for the letter of intent to spell that out. Due diligence is basically referring to that period of time when representatives of all the organizations participating in the transaction get a chance to look each other over, get a chance to kick the tires, go through the files, make sure they understand everything that they need to about this other organization or organizations that they're thinking about forming a new relationship with. We'll say a little bit more about due diligence later in the presentation, but the time period during which due diligence can take place is something that really should be spelled out in the letter of intent, partly because you don't want to have other organizations, having access to your records for huge amounts of time. You want that to be relatively focused, and again, your counsel can help you with that. Again, related to schedule, as I said, it's very important for the board to be involved, and so there needs to be, based on the particular scheduled board meetings for an organization, whether they're monthly or every other month or maybe even quarterly, there needs to be a schedule for when a presentation or when a transaction is going to be presented to the board, whether it's presented to them for their initial review, maybe they should approve the letter of intent to allow the preliminary discussions to go forward, and then later on to sign off on the transaction as a whole. Last but not least is the statutory requirements, which again I'll say a little bit more about later, and those are really just the finer points of legal compliance, both at the state and federal level, and so there needs to be some clear idea about when those documents are going to be filed, and we'll say a little bit more about that later on in this presentation. I'll stop here and ask if anybody has any questions that they want to jump in with.
Any questions initially about the process of engaging in a merger? Okay, looks like everybody's clear and excited for more. Okay, well now we'll move forward to, doesn't always have to be called the Memorandum of Understanding, but that's what we've chosen to call it. And it's actually one of the more important pieces of the whole puzzle, and it's often a piece that is neglected or sort of left out of the conversation. And the reason why it's so important is because this is really where you get down and dirty about what's going to happen after the transaction is going to take place. How are these organizations going to work together? How much of what we call post-merger integration is going to have to take place? And from the perspective of a chief executive or a board that might be thinking more in terms of mission or exciting new programming, it can sometimes happen that these finer details are overlooked. And I think for the benefit of everybody, particularly all the staff members of the organizations, it's best if they're not overlooked, if they're talked about in advance. So some of these issues relate to human resources and payment systems. Of course, if you're integrating payment systems, you want everybody to be able to receive their paychecks on time. You want whatever retirement, merger of retirement plans has to take place. You want that to go smoothly so that people don't feel like their retirement is at stake. Issues regarding titles, seniority. It's often helpful to
look at a new org chart, figure out what's going to be in it. At the level of leadership, it's also, it's surprising how often this issue is sort of left till too late in the process. And the question with that is really, if you have 2 or 3 organizations, that means you have 2 or 3 CEOs. Are they all going to stay on board after the transaction? Or is one of them going to become the CEO? Is another one going to take on another responsibility? Oftentimes these things happen somewhat naturally in that people decide for themselves what they'd like to do. Sometimes if you've been the executive director of a small organization and you've shepherded the organization through the growth cycle to the point that it gets to join a much larger organization, maybe at that point you as an executive director are ready to step back or take a different role within the new organization. So those leadership issues are something that really needs to be discussed. As someone who's spent part of their career as a fundraiser, it's also important to think about donor databases. That can be a huge issue depending on how heavily populated the databases are. If you have 2 databases that are in 2 different systems, both of which track on a month by month or year by year basis some long-term relationship with donors, and those 2 systems don't merge very well, the migration breaks down or certain information is lost, that can be a serious blow to an organization. So, getting your IT people involved early on and thinking about all that post-merger integration is extremely important. And I think, as I say, under the second bullet point on this slide, the people who are sort of handling the transaction, whether that's the chief executives of the organization, whether that's a committee of board members that has been delegated the task of handling the transaction, whoever that group of people is, that they should consider, taking the time to seek input from across the organization, whether it's the IT people or the HR people or all the program staff. Just gather as much information as you can about how a transaction like the kinds we're talking about might affect each of these organizations, and try to fend off all the negative effects as much as possible. Again, that involves ensuring that the needs that are being addressed by the transaction have been properly identified, whether that's through some, document that a consultant has helped prepare, or maybe it's the result of a board retreat that's, leading up to the transaction. And then I think, the issue of disseminating information about the transaction, both to your staff, to your donors, to your board, to the public, thinking about all of that so that it doesn't come as a surprise, that people understand what's happening and why it's happening, particularly at the staff level. You can certainly understand why this would be a difficult thing if word of a merger or some other kind of transaction gets around inside an organization. People start to worry, are there going to be job cuts? Is my position going to be found redundant with some position within the other organization? The more you can do to allay those concerns, the better off you are. So that gives you a good sense of all the different things that you can touch on in a memorandum of understanding or some other kind of document that sort of comes later on after the preliminary discussions have been well underway. So I am a lawyer, and as I said, part of what we were going to be talking about today were some of the legal issues. I'm not drilling down on them because I think that, these transactions, each of them is a little bit different from all the others, and so, what legal issues are going to come up is really best something that's worked through with your own counsel. I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. So I just feel like I have to make that clear. But I did just want to point out really the key issues. One is compliance with state statutes, and that's the Nebraska Nonprofit Corporation Act, Section 21-19. So if you look at that section, it's just basically about notifying the Secretary of State when a merger has taken place by filing a plan of merger. Again, there's some language in there about the surviving entity assuming all of the liabilities of the preceding entities. Sometimes things don't work out quite that way, and depending on what the contract or the merger agreement says. But obviously, you want to comply with all the reporting requirements of the Nebraska Nonprofit Corporation Act. And then at the federal level, there are several things to take into account. As far as these reporting requirements at the federal level, they're pretty much summed up in IRS publication 4779. So I would recommend that you have a look at that. But the other issues that are a little trickier because you're never quite sure whether the IRS is going to drill down into the details of the transaction and want to discuss some of these issues. But the two ones that raise real red flags are the questions of private inurement or private benefit. Private inurement is something very specific related to people who are connected to the organization. So is there a board member who owns a building that's going to be sold for, a couple $100,000 more than its market value, as part of a transaction between two or more nonprofits? Those kinds of issues are usually easy to spot, and if you've handled your conflict of interest policy with the board well generally, then it's something that should come clear. But you definitely want to be careful in keeping your eye out for private inurement issues, really profit-making opportunities presented by a transaction. Private benefit is a little looser, and actually the prohibition on private inurement is absolute, whereas the prohibition on private benefit, it's a little more fact-specific, and the question is often, well, is the benefit substantial as opposed to insubstantial? And those are cases that are a little more hard to describe, a little vague. So let's say, for instance, that as a result of a merger or some other kind of strategic alliance, a group of organizations wants to build a new facility. And let's say there's a parcel of land across the street from this facility that happens to be owned by a board member. Now, that parcel of land might have nothing whatsoever to do with the transaction or the opening of a new facility or anything, but one could make the argument that there is some private benefit involved. And those are the kinds of issues that you're going to want to explore with your counsel when thinking about a strategic alliance. And the last one of these more technical issues is UBIT, unrelated business income tax. And again, this is the UBIT question comes up all the time. It's not just something that comes up in strategic alliance situations. So in a way, it's something that the board and the various advisors of an organization should always be aware of. Is the organization engaging in any kind of activity at a substantial enough level that it could be considered business activity that's unrelated to the tax-exempt purpose of the organization? So the reason why this is relevant to a strategic alliance situation is that you might not really be aware of everything that another organization is involved in, but some of those activities might raise the issue of unrelated business income tax. So in terms of going through the due diligence process and understanding everything that the other organization is involved in, this is one of the reasons why, because you don't want to find out all of a sudden that you're liable for some UBIT. And then the last issue in the category of legal and compliance issues is just wondering and figuring out whether the new organization is going to need to seek its own 501c3 status. And again, this is something that's handled differently from situation to situation. So for instance, with regard to Restoration Exchange, the organization I'm most closely connected with at the moment, they did not seek a new 501c3 status for Restoration Exchange. What they did is relied on the 501c3 status of one of the three preceding organizations, Landmarks Inc. So when you read the new documents, what it says is Landmarks Inc. doing business as Restoration Exchange Omaha. So it just kind of, there can be different reasons for trying to sort of piggyback on a pre-existing 501c3 status. For one thing, it certainly helps if you can say this is an organization that has been in continuous existence for 50 years, as is the case with Landmarks Inc. But there could be other kinds of reasons too. But establishing whether or not you're going to need to apply for 501c3 status for some new organization is a key piece to the puzzle.
Is there a mission-related question to that, such that, you know, where you have to ask yourself if the mission of the new merge, you know, organization or the strategic alliance is still, you know, closely related enough to the original tax-exempt application and the charitable purposes described in that? Is that
definitely? I mean, I think that's actually even. I mean, from a legal perspective, of course, the number one question is going to be, you know, is the tax are the tax-exempt purposes of the preceding corporations still being pursued, or are there new activities? But even aside from that question, there's the issue of even if both organizations or three organizations, or even if they're all presumed perfectly legitimate tax-exempt purposes, thinking about what the post-transaction organization is going to look like. So, for instance, do you need to amend the bylaws to change the wording of the mission? Do you need to think? Well, obviously, you're probably going to think about how you're going to describe your organization in all the Form 990s and other tax forms that you file in the future. So, I don't think there's anything. I mean, as long as both missions are tax exempt, you're fine. But in terms of the broader picture of how the organization defines itself, what's in the bylaws, what's in the how does it fit into, as I said before, existing planning documents is important. So,
thank you.
So for now, I thought I would just sort of toss out a few factoids related to mergers and other kinds of strategic alliances that are happening in the nonprofit sector right now, because it's informative, and there has been research done tracking these transactions. So there's no reason why we shouldn't learn from all that research. And one of the first things that becomes clear is that merger activity and other kinds of strategic alliance activity are not as common in the nonprofit sector as they are in the for-profit sector. They're not that, it's about half the rate of mergers in the nonprofit sector is about half the rate in the for-profit sector. And the reasons for that are clear, I think, once you sort of delve down into the situation. Most for-profit companies that engage in one merger have engaged in multiple mergers, that this is something that they pursue as part of their business model, and it's something that they become fairly skilled at. Whereas in the nonprofit sector, oftentimes a strategic alliance or a merger of some kind, it might be the only transaction of that kind that an organization has ever pursued. It might be something completely new. So that affects how the transaction is conducted, because the people involved maybe have never been involved in a strategic alliance before. And that's, again, another case where your advisors, your counsel, your accountants, your bankers can all come in handy. A second observation, and I do think that this shapes the conversation in ways that have to be taken into account, is the fact that most nonprofit mergers involve one or more distressed organizations. That is to say that the strategic alliance is happening because one or more of the organizations needs help. And that's perfectly fine. It's great that organizations reach out and use strategic alliances as a way to help out distressed organizations. But it's also something that you need to sort of keep in mind as you're going through the transaction. That sometimes it's important to try to maintain a level head when you're dealing with an organization which may, for all we know, be on the brink of bankruptcy. And then another thing to note about the way things are happening out there now, and this sort of follows up on some of the things we said earlier, there are different sectors that are experiencing different levels of merger activity. There's more transactions happening in the human services sector, as we noted earlier, for reasons related to methodology, for reasons related to the Affordable Care Act, and pressures coming from both private and government funders. So you're going to see more strategic alliances in the human services sector than you are going to see in the culture sector. Youth-focused programs, I think that's another area where you're likely to see a lot of consolidations and other kinds of strategic alliances. As a matter of fact, one of the sort of collective impact organizations in Omaha is focused on youth programming, Collective for Youth. So.
Yeah, I have found out that they do not in fact consider themselves a collective impact group, because they're not addressing all the 5 requirements, but they are an example of sort of extreme collaboration among different youth-focused education and welfare providers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of collective impact, which is a term that has been bandied about quite a lot in the last 4 or 5 years by funders, thanks luckily to a consulting firm called FSG based in the Bay Area, and I think you actually cite their Stanford Innovation Review article that talks a lot about that. Mm-hmm. So in addition to ideas about collective impact, funders have taken a lot of interest in strategic alliances in general for all the reasons that we've talked about, to sort of reduce the number of organizations that they have to think about funding, to increase impact by sort of joining forces, and when it comes to government-funded organizations, oftentimes the administrative difficulties of dealing with being funded by the government are so great that it's just automatically better to have one organization doing it rather than 3 or 4, if that's possible in any given sector. So those are just a few of the things that are happening out there in the merger world. I don't know if anybody has any other observations about what they see going on out there, but feel free to bring them up at the end of our conversation. So now let's circle back to due diligence again. And due diligence is something that it starts at different points in a transaction, but it should definitely take place before conversations go too far. And just to give you an idea of how deep due diligence can be, I have provided a copy of a due diligence checklist, which is a list of all the documents that are often reviewed in the course of due diligence related to a strategic alliance. So Todd, I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, so I just sent everyone a link through the chat feature to this checklist that David is talking about. Feel free to click on it, download it, and take a look at that as David talks about due diligence.
Yeah, and there's nothing written in stone about that particular checklist. I mean, if you go to Google and type in nonprofit merger checklist, you're actually going to get a number of different examples. Some of them much more focused on specific areas, like doing due diligence of a human resources operation, or doing due diligence regarding all the intellectual property that an organization might own. So the size and the complexity of the organization and the nature of the transaction are all going to influence how deep and how long the due diligence phase is going to be. But one of it that definitely needs, or 2 parts of it really, that definitely need to come into account is the review of investment and banking relations, and how many bank accounts are there between the various organizations involved? Does one or more of the organizations have an endowment? Do they have a financial advisor who's handling that endowment? Are endowments going to be combined? Is there a pool of charitable gift annuities or other forms of planned gifts that are out there that have to be dealt with? Is there a portfolio of stocks or other kinds of assets that the different organizations own? How are those going to be handled? Those are all extremely important issues just in terms of bringing the organizations together. And then last but not least, I'd say that when you're reviewing these documents, there are a couple things that due diligence experts are taught to focus on. And one is a change of control provisions. There's often clauses in agreements of different kinds, and it could be an employment agreement, it could be a vendor agreement, it could be a software agreement. You never know where it's going to pop up, that say, look, if this organization, if there's a change of control that takes place, if this organization, is merged into another organization or something like that, then this contract is no longer valid, or you're required to notify, your bank or your insurance company. So looking for those change of control provisions in various documents that are going to come under scrutiny in the due diligence phase is extremely important. Even apart from change of control provisions, there's a lot of notice provisions that simply say, every grant agreement is going to have a notice provision that says, look, if the nature of the organization receiving this grant changes, then you have to provide us with notice. And sometimes it might even be, more stringent than that, like saying that you have to have a merger approved by a major funder before you can even pursue it if you want to keep the funding. So those are just some of the things to keep your eye out for during the due diligence phase. And then we're going to talk about communications and fundraising. And as I said when talking about the Memorandum of Understanding and post-merger integration, this tends to be one of the areas that isn't talked about quite as much as I think it should be. And as a result, there are many strategic alliance situations where feathers end up being ruffled inadvertently, whether it's the feathers of donors or foundations or government agencies. So thinking through the effect of the transaction on all the relationships with major funders is extremely important, and figuring out where there need to be conversations. This is especially the case with small organizations. So, if there's a small organization with a budget of, maybe under $100,000 a year, and it's being looked at as a merger candidate by a much larger organization. Well, this small, often community-based organization might be largely the result of the good faith of just a few donors, maybe even one donor. And obviously, those donors need to be notified. They need to be made aware of anything that's going on in the area of strategic alliances. They need to have a chance to express their opinions. From a donor perspective, it can be a very serious thing. If you're used to being the major donor for a very small organization that's working on a very specific mission that you are passionate about, that can be a big change. Then, if that small organization is swallowed up by a much larger organization, you're writing a different name on your checks. Your money is going toward a much broader array of purposes, perhaps, and you don't have the same level of assurance that you know exactly how your money is going to be used. You might have the sense that more of your gifts are being used for overhead or those kinds of things. Although I think one of the goals of strategic alliances is to lower the cost of overhead, but that's not always the case. So thinking about those communications with major funders is extremely important. It will save you a lot of headaches down the line. Also thinking about the effect of the transaction on the role of whatever the surviving entity is in the community. Is it an organization that a brand new organization that came into being because two organizations merged? Is it an organization that has kind of moved into the neighborhood on its own? Has it moved into the neighborhood with some help from a locally based organization where there's a kind of connection between the two that's been established? Thinking very carefully about the effect on the community is important, partly because that's probably one of the main reasons for undertaking the transaction in the first place, is to have a certain desired effect on the community. And then branding is also extremely important. Are all the organizations participating in the strategic alliance going to lose their identity? Is there going to be a brand new organization with its own identity? Is there going to be kind of a merger of identities? So, so for instance, think of an organization called Lutheran Family Services. And if you look at the history of Lutheran Family Services, they've absorbed various organizations over time. And sometimes those organizations, and this happens elsewhere, so it's not necessarily, I don't need to focus exclusively on youth and family services, but so the smaller organizations that become part of the big organization often keep their own brand and their own identity to some degree, because that was partly what motivated the transaction in the first place, was some desire to capitalize on that brand, because it has deeper roots in a particular community, or it has, you know, more respect with regard to a particular form of expertise. So oftentimes you'll see where the brands of two organizations appear on the same sign or the same brochure, with one much smaller than the other, and oftentimes, you know, the larger organization will just say, you know, will designate the smaller organization as a program of, so that you always have an awareness of the two organizations, but you also are aware that they're working together. So planning out those issues in advance and making sure that everybody is on the same page. Oftentimes, what you'll find is that if a larger organization is merging with a small organization, that people in the small organization are a little bit surprised by the changes that take place in terms of their branding and identity after the transaction. And then how are all these things going to be reflected in communications materials, whether it's your annual report, whether it's your annual or semi-annual letter to donors, any brochures that you're producing, your website. The website is an extremely important place for handling of the public perceptions of the organization, delving into social media, maybe letting people know at some point in the process about the merger happening through social media. That can actually be a great communications moment. It can help get people excited. So on the communications and fundraising front, those are some of the issues that I think really need to be taken into account.
Have any questions or comments about communications and fundraising as part of a strategic alliance? Okay, hearing none, we will move on.
Okay, we have a quiet group today. So last but not least, I just have one more slide, and we've alluded it to a little bit earlier, is post-merger integration. And this is something that gets talked about a lot in the for-profit sector, and oftentimes you'll hear about transactions foundering because the post-merger integration did not succeed. So again, this is the kind of thing that the more advanced thinking you can give to it, the better. The good news about post-merger integration is that because funders are putting more emphasis on strategic alliances, they are also allowing for things like providing grants to organizations to help them with post-merger integration. You're going to start seeing this you already are a little bit, but you're going to start seeing it more and more, that people are going to be applying for grants. And just like they used to apply for grants, or they still apply for grants to help implement a strategic plan, well, there's going to be people applying for grants to manage post-merger integration. And that partly involves all those technical issues I was talking about earlier with human resources and with the donor database and that kind of thing. But it also just involves the culture of the organizations. How often do they have their group meetings? How often do they have staff retreats? How frequently does the CEO of the organization talk to the staff? Thinking through all those things and sort of coming up with a plan, maybe going out as far as the first year of the new organization. That's often how for-profit transactions are handled. So making a plan for how the first year is going to be handled in terms of the boards, CEOs, the donors, the staff of the organizations, and try to address as many of the operational and cultural issues as possible through the implementation period.
The reason I put implementation in parentheses there is because hopefully this has already been considered well before and in the planning phases, but now you haven't decided that, well, because the planning was done and the transaction is complete, that this thing will just go on its own.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. I mean, just making sure that the transaction has a reality to it, that it has a life to it, that it's not something that just happens on paper or something that just happens at the dinner table between two CEOs, but rather it's something that really affects all of the organizations involved at all levels, where everyone involved has a clear sense of what the goals of the transaction are and how they're going to help the organizations and help with delivery of services and ultimately result in a more effective nonprofit sector. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, David. Do any of our viewers and listeners have any questions? Feel free to use the chat feature on the left side of the screen to type in your questions if you have any, and we'd be happy to address them.
I should say too that my email appears on the screen right now, and if in a couple of days from now, a couple of weeks from now, some question pops into your head, feel free to email me directly, and I'll do my best to respond.
Excellent. Well, we must have done an excellent job, David, because we don't have any questions. I think you've done a fantastic job of helping us understand some of the larger issues at stake, both cultural and mission related, but then also some of the legal and procedural aspects of forming a strategic alliance. And so I want to thank you for coming out today and sharing your expertise with us. And I look forward to working with you again.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.